Hi there and welcome back to 355 Code. This will be another JavaScript beginner tutorial, and today we'll be making a Tic Tac Toe game. So as you can see here, I have my environment open on SoloLearn, and we'll be doing just JavaScript, so I kind of moved the HTML and CSS here to the side. If you're not familiar, here's where we write our code, and here on the right we'll see basically a display with our web page. So let's get started. Tic-tac-toe, basically we need to build a board with a 3x3 grid. So let's start by creating our board element, and this will just be a div. We'll just call it board. So board will be equal to document.createElement, and just a simple div. And now we're going to give this div some styles, and the way we're going to do this is we're going to try and get creative here, and instead of adding the styles one by one, let's create an object that will basically hold all the styling for this board. So I'm going to call this board styles, and this is kind of just like our mini CSS for this project, but we're not using CSS, we're using pure JavaScript. And let's give it a border solid. So it is important to write the styles here correctly as we would in JavaScript and not necessarily as we would in CSS. And I'm going to start by giving it a height of 100 pixels. Even though we'll be changing this later on, I just kind of want to make sure that, just to make sure everything's working and our div is visual. So I'm just going to give it some height and width. And we're going to add more styles to this later. But let's first set up the application of these styles to our board element. And the way we're going to do that is we're basically going to loop through all of these keys and their values in this object, and we're going to do that using a method called object.keys, and this basically accesses all the keys within a certain object, and we pass the object in over here, so the object will be board styles, and this returns an array with all the keys of the object. So now we have an array and we just need to loop through it using for each. And so for each, let's just call it style. We're basically going to say that board dot style of that specific style is equal to the value of that key. So that'll be equal to board styles style. Okay, and let's last thing we want to do is just append our board to the body of our HTML. And that way we'll be able to actually see it on our display. So let's take a look at this. We'll run our code, and as you can see, we have a very nice board kind of displaying here on the side. And the next thing we're going to want to do is really add in our grid. Okay, so it's going to be a 3x3 grid. So let's start by adding grid boxes. And let's just say that we're going to want to add here 9 of these grid boxes, and these are going to be div elements as well. So we're going to create a very simple for loop here, and for I equals 0, and as long as I is smaller than 9, right, because in total we're going to be adding 9 of these grid boxes, and I++. And basically each time we run through this loop, we're going to be adding a new grid box. So let's just declare that grid box. And this grid box will be equal to document.createElement div. And let's basically use the same styling method since we've already kind of built it up over here. Let's just copy over the code we have over here. And we'll just call this grid box styles. And we'll change that as over here as well. Grid box styles. And here we have, instead of board, we're going to want to have grid box. And we're going to want to have here grid box styles. You could also write out the code again. I prefer copying and pasting, and worst case, work out some small bugs that we have afterwards. So for these, we'll keep the border solid. Let's make this 30 pixels by 30 pixels. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to append these to the board. Grid box. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have now when we run our code. Great, so we have 9 grid boxes, and obviously we don't want them going straight down in a line, but we actually want these to be laid out on our board in a 3x3 grid. So let's actually style our board a little more, and we'll make it display grid. Make sure to add the commas here. And in terms of the grid layout, we're going to add a grid template columns, and we're going to use the repeat, and we'll just do 3 columns, each one 50 pixels, let's say. And let's see, we're going to add rows as well, so that's pretty much the same thing as this, so let's copy that over. And this will just be rows. So let's just run our code and see what we have here. Okay, so it's kind of spread out a bit. That's the discrepancy here with the 50 and 30. So let's really make this 50 and 50 as well. I just want to make it a little bigger. Great, and now it's much more spread out. And let's kind of kill this height and width here. And instead of making it 100 pixels, let's fit to content. Excellent. And now you can see that we have a pretty solid board. You know, you could always add more styling and whatnot, but this is pretty good for a simple game of tic-tac-toe. So now we can kind of move on to the logic of our game. And just right before we do that, I'm going to give each of these grid boxes, here, let's just clean up our code a little bit, and I'm going to give each of these grid boxes an ID. So let's do that right over here before we append child. And we're going to do that by setting an attribute, ID, and we're going to let the ID be determined by, so let's call this grid box, and we'll just say plus I. Okay, and then each one will have a unique ID. So now we can move on to our logic, and basically what we want to do is to add a an X or an O when we click on one of these grid boxes. So in order to do that, we're going to need to add an event listener for click, and each time this event is fired, we will execute a function. And the function will go as such. We'll define a new element, and this is, we're just going to use actually emojis here just for simplicity's sake. So let's call this piece, and it's actually just going to be create element and it's going to be a simple paragraph element. And then let's go for a second and find, so I'm going to use X emoji. So that's going to be this X emoji right over here. And I'm going to copy this over to our code for a second. And let's just search for red O emoji. And right here. So these are, I like using emojis because it's simple. We don't need to import images or anything like that. And the formatting and everything will be kind of simple. You can obviously use whatever you want. If you want, you can do, instead of X against O, you can do angry faces against smiley faces or whatnot. And basically what we're going to do here is the inner HTML of this piece will be either X or O. So basically, let's say piece dot inner HTML equals either X or O. So how do we determine if it's X or O? So for now, let's say it's equal to a variable called turn. And up here, right before we do anything, let's declare this variable turn. And to start with, it'll be equal to X because X usually starts. And don't forget these emojis are strings, so they need to go within quotation marks. And then basically, let's already add a condition here. So one thing we could do is we can make an if statement. So I'm going to start with an if statement, and I'm going to show you how we can kind of shorten that down to something else. So if turn is equal to X, then turn will be equal to O. Okay, basically we change the turn of the player, and in any other case, this turn will be equal to X. Sorry, let me copy that over from here. X. So this is one way to write it out. Visually, it's quite clear, but we can also use a ternary statement, and it might be more clear, or I mean, it's definitely more concise. And basically, we can just write it like this. So we can just say turn equals X, and then question mark, and then if it's true, then execute this, and if it is false, then we will execute this. So as you can see, it's quite concise, and it's quite useful for these kinds of situations where the logic is very simple and very visual as well because of the emojis. Yeah, so that's what we wanted to do over here. And let me see why I'm getting board styles, for loop, and okay, we have the event listener here. That's great, that's great. Trying to see where we have some problem with the code. Let's see, maybe we'll get syntax missing after argument list. Let's see where that might be coming in here. Debugging, it's always the funnest part of coding. Figuring out where that tiny little mistake is. So after searching for a bit, I found our typo right up here. So let's erase that. And let's just add a few more lines before we move on to testing. Because really now we didn't really attach the piece. So let's also append the piece to the grid box. And now we should already be getting something visual. So let's run that, and you can see that as I click, we are appending something to the grid box, but I'm getting an error and our turns aren't really switching around here. So we have a small problem. Let me try putting that in over there, and now it is working. Okay, so it's important, I think, when you have this ternary function that you're using the semicolons. Sometimes it doesn't matter when you're writing JavaScript, but in this case, it does. So, okay, so we got that basic logic working. We have a problem here that if I keep on clicking, it keeps on adding pieces, and we'll deal with that shortly. But let's deal first with some styling. So this will just do the regular styling method here. So let's do it like this. We'll just do piece.style. Let's start with font size. So let's make it something nice and big. Let's do, let's say 30 pixels. And let's run our code again. Okay, so now these are pretty big. And maybe even a little too big. No, they look like they would fit quite nicely into these squares. And let's just add a little bit of margin. And let's say 10 pixels. Let's see how this looks now. Okay, so now they're a little more centered. Let's add another 5 pixels of margin, see how that looks. Okay, that was too much. So let's add 7 pixels. And let's say 8 pixels. Okay, so it's pretty good. They're not completely centered. Yeah, I can maybe push it another. We could start fighting around here with the different, the margin top and the margin right, the margin left. Yeah, but for me, this is good enough. If you want to play with it a little more in your own version of the game, be my guest. And basically, what we want to do is to make sure that we don't have a situation like this where clicking on each box can constantly add more and more pieces. So in order to do that, we basically need to check before we execute the content of our event listener. Let's just make a condition here that will only do that if there's no children in this grid. And the way we're going to do that is just by checking the length of children. And if it's equal to 0, then we'll execute this bit of code here. And let's wrap that all around here. Excellent. So let's try running our code again. And now you see I'm clicking here and it's not adding anymore. It only adds 1 per square. So we're 2/3 of the way done. Now we just basically need to determine and see if someone won the game. I mean, technically the game is functional now because you can just play and, if you see that someone won, then, game over. Okay, you win. But let's kind of make our game a little smarter, and we want our game to be able to tell if someone has won or not. And the way we're going to do that is basically by, I mean, it's a little bit of a hard coding. It's not such a smart method, but it works for, this kind of simple 3x3 grid. I mean, it's not scalable. So, if we were playing tic-tac-toe with a larger grid, or it's a different, more complicated game, this method might not work. But it's definitely simple, easy to understand, and easy to code out. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to define which situations are considered wins. And we're basically going to structure this as an array of arrays. And each subarray will be one of the winning combinations. So let's say 0, 1, 2. Remember, because we're talking about an array here, and we used I equals 0 to create our grid boxes. So we're basically going to do 0, 1, 2. And that's one win. And then all the other wins could be, let's say, 3, 4, 5, and 6, 7, 8. So that was basically these three, and then we're going to want to do these three from top to bottom. So that would be 0, 3, 6, and 1, 4, 7, and 2, 5, 8. And then the last two we'll have to do are just the diagonals. So that's 0, 0, 4, 8, and the last one would be 2, 4, 6. And you can just copy this from my code if you want. You don't really have to go and type it out all by yourself, but if you want to double check and understand everything a little better, then you are welcome to. And now basically what we're going to do is each time we place a piece, we are going to check if each one of these arrays is complete. And if one of them is complete, then we know that it's a winning piece. So let's, dive into that, and then you'll see exactly what I mean here in terms of going through each one. So after we put a piece down, basically we're going to loop through these arrays, and we're going to see if the piece that we just put belongs to one of these subarrays. And that way we know that which subarrays we need to check for a win. Because, if I put a piece over here, then the top row is not going to be, it's not part of the top row. So we don't need to check the top row in terms of winning. But we do need to check, let's say, the middle row here and the rightmost row over here. So how is this going to work? Wins dot for each. And let's just call each option here a win. It's a win. Those are the subarrays within the wins array that we declared up top. And the next thing that we're going to do is check each of these, loop through each of these subarrays as well. So win dot for each, and let's just call these, let's say, box. And now what we're going to want to do is within each one of these boxes, we are going to check if each corresponding, we're going to check basically what the inner HTML is for each corresponding grid box in the actual game. And so let's just say let piece in box, and that will be equal to document dot get element by ID, and the ID is going to be grid box, and then box. Okay, so basically when we get to, for example, up here, let's say we're checking this subarray, so we'll be checking grid box 0, grid box 1, grid box 2. And the inner HTML for grid box 0 will be an X. For grid box 2, it'll be, for grid box 1, sorry, it'll be an X, but there won't be anything for grid box 2, so that means there's no game win on this array at least. And basically we're going to do that for each and every one of the arrays. And we're going to be wanting to get the inner HTML for this grid box. And now basically we're going to need to make another array which is going to store specifically these piece in box. And we'll just call that winning array. And we'll start it off as an empty array. And basically, for each piece in box, we'll push it into the winning array. And then the last thing that we need to do is that when we exit this loop, we need to see if the winning array is a winning array or not. And the way we'll do that is just using a method called every. So basically it loops through the array, and for every item, okay, I'm just going to use I to mark item, and for each item, if it's equal to, it checks if it's equal to, and in this case we'll just use winning array 0. So go through the array and check if each item is equal to winning array 0, and this will basically check if the entire array is equal to itself, and that would indicate that we have 3 X's or 3 O's within the array. And we're not really particular on which one it is at the moment when we're checking this part of the logic. And the last thing that we want to check is just that the length of this array is 3, because if it's not 3, then it's not a winning array, even if the items are equal to each other. So that would be winning array dot length equals to 3. And in that case, that this is true, then what we're going to want to do is, let's say console.log game over. For now, we'll change that up soon. And let's check our code. So we wrote a lot now, and let's check to see if anything here is working. So I put an X here, and it already tells me game over. So obviously there is something that is not going as it should. So let's console winning array 0. Okay, just to try and, basically what we're doing now is debugging. So let's, whoops, I didn't do console, I just wrote down. Excellent. Okay, let's try that again. Great. So basically we have here kind of an empty string. Let's just console the entire array. Let's not even console a specific. Okay, so basically we have 3 empty strings. So what we're going to want to do is filter out when we're pushing to the array and when not. So let's add another if statement right over here. And let's just say if piece in box, okay, is not equal to blank. then we will push to the array. So let's try that out. Let's see what happens here. So, okay, so game is not over, so that's already progress. And let's try playing out the game. Game over. Okay, and we logged here the, the entire inner HTML of the of this grid box. Yeah, so that's kind of a lot here. So this is working. And now our game is pretty advanced because we can kind of tell when the game is over, which is, a great first step. And what we might want to do is to tell, basically to stop us from being able to put out more pieces once the game is over. So to do that, we can really just declare another variable up here. And let's say let game over, and that will be equal to false to begin with because the game is not over. And if when we do this game over here, let's just say game over equals to true, and we will wrap everything here in the condition. So we already have one condition of putting out more pieces, and that's that there's no other piece there, but we can add another condition that game over is not, that game is not over yet. And let's try running that code. So game over, and now you see that I cannot put any more pieces. So, if you want to kind of run forward more with this code, you can try to, make the game over message a little more advanced, determine who won, let's say, etc. I'm going to kind of leave it at this for now. I think that we have very good functionality for this game. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot. If you like this video, please give us a like. Don't forget to subscribe to see more JavaScript tutorials and more games like this. And we'll see you next time.